So it seems as though there's a news article every day about how the younger generation lack the resilience or the work ethic of their parents. You know, there's even a nickname to sum up this apparent lack of discipline and disregard for the demands of the modern workplace, and, you know, the so-called Snowflake generation. But do younger people present problems for employers in terms of laziness or being too fragile? Or is this just a myth? Well, with me today to discuss this is an expert on this topic. And so a really big welcome to Alex Atherton, who is the author of the forthcoming book, The Snowflake Myth. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's lovely to have you on the show. And before we get into it, maybe we should start by establishing your credentials as an expert in this area, or at least an important voice in this debate. So, can you give our listeners just a brief summary of your background?
Okay, so for almost 25 years, I worked in secondary schools. Just over half that time, I was a head teacher. So
what did you teach? What was your teaching subject?
Oh, well, you could tell that I hadn't really planned going into teaching as a profession. So I started out as a A-level government and politics teacher, which means that you teach that, and then anything else that needs teaching, you're also given it. So I've taught history, geography, ICT, RS, English.
It is amazing that actually I started, before I kind of worked out what I wanted to do, I did some teaching in sixth forms and teaching that kind of A-level group. So the kind of 16 to 18 year olds for listeners who are outside of the UK. And similarly, I was history, but they gave me politics. They gave me English and also communication skills for electrical installation engineers, the ones who were kind of on day release.
Right.
I tell you what, it was a very good grounding in how to manage a group of people. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So you were a teacher and then you became a head in a secondary school. Was that in the private sector? Was it in the kind of comprehensive state sector?
So I started my career, I'm from Yorkshire originally, started my career in Manchester or Trafford, moved to London with a senior post. So my first headship, 2/3 of my headship time was done in Tottenham, North London. The rest of it... So
again, for listeners who don't know the UK, that's not necessarily one of the most affluent areas.
No, it's not. And it certainly wasn't then at that point. Also worked in central London as a head, which people thought I'd left to go to a more prosperous area with easier kids. But actually, the percentage of kids on free school meals who qualified for them was higher there. They're in Tottenham. It was baggy trousers school, if you like, for listeners of a certain age, where Suggs went to school and wrote a song about it, basically.
He went to that school.
He went to that school, yeah.
Right. So for people who don't know, check it out on Spotify. Madness is the band, Baggy Trousers, and it was that school that you were in. Oh my word, that must have been it. But fascinating. It must be. I mean, you bet you had a good time as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I also worked in a pupil referral unit for a little bit. So where
that's the really, really challenging kids.
Yeah, where they go when they're not in school, or they've been have to be somewhere else for a bit. So I worked a lot with Gen Z, who are now the youngest generation in the workplace.
And is it Gen Z or Gen Z?
Well,
what do we call it?
It's funny, actually, because I started, like, all my video stuff that I did near the beginning says Z.
Yeah.
But the more focus groups I did with the young people themselves, increasingly Z. So I suppose it's an Americanism. Every time
Also
I
a bit
talk,
cooler, isn't it?
yeah. There's a
And
bit.
also, my daughter, who basically learned her alphabet from Sesame Street, me plonking her in front of, well, I was trying to get some work done, put her in front of Sesame Street. She used to say Z, so there you go. I think it's fine. We'll call it Gen Z.
I ask people, what do you want me to call them if I'm doing a speaking gig or something? And there's more and more Z's than used. It's Z's that win, but there's more Z's than there used to be. Put it that way. So it's becoming increasingly common.
Right, good. We'll go with Gen Z. So you know this group, you've worked with this group, both as, younger and the group that have now become Gen Z. I can't remember what we're on at the moment. I think we've gone back to the start of the alphabet, haven't we?
Yes.
But so you know this group. How did you transition out of education? Why did you transition out of education?
Well, to cut a long story short, there was, I found some notes to self about a year or two after I came out, which indicated I was thinking about this a lot more than I thought I was. But in effect, I have a daughter who's now 13. At the time, sort of early years of primary school. And by the time it got to the third week in a row of not seeing her awake from Sunday night to Friday night, that started to get on my nerves. So I gave myself a year to try and earn a living another way. That was all school improvement stuff. And then I, over time, have jettisoned pretty much all of that and do a lot of leadership coaching, one-to-one with teams, and talk and write about Gen Z.
So you've got a book coming out, haven't you?
I have, yes.
And the title of your book, the Snowflake Myth, that's right, isn't it? The Snowflake Myth. It does suggest by the name of it that you're coming down on the side of the argument that young people, we'll call them Gen Z as a kind of catch-all, that they're actually not lazy, they're not work shy, they're not feeble, and they're none of the labels that we keep reading about. So before we kind of have a look at whether these labels have any validity at all, where do you think they've come from? What's led to this generation attracting such negative perceptions that we keep reading about in the press?
Yeah, so there are different years given sometimes as to where Gen Z starts and ends, but I'm talking about those up to mid to late 20s now. So I think it's always been a good story. Young people are not as good as you, right? I think that's always been a good story. And I had that as well.
Yeah, and our parents had it. Yeah.
And I was able to grow up when I wouldn't have to do, manual work necessarily, and moving to tertiary sector and all of that, you're soft. You don't know you're born. You don't have to fight in the war, all that kind of thing. So it's not a new theme.
There was that Monty Python sketch, wasn't there, about, I used to live in a cardboard box, bloody luxury.
Right. That's right. Yeah, Yorkshireman, certainly recognise that from my youth.
Yeah.
And I think that's now been amplified by, there's a lot of clickbait with it, I think.
Yeah.
And certainly in this day and age, people who buy the printed press, certain demographic or certain websites, certain demographic. So there's something there that appeals, easy target. The recipients or the recipient of the message that, those on the other side of it, less likely to read it. So I think there's also that. I think there's a couple of other aspects as well, though. I think there is, perhaps amongst my own generation, I'd consider myself right in the middle of Gen X. There's often a lack of understanding that young people coming through don't necessarily want the same life as we had or don't want. And that can be accompanied by, well, I had to go through this, so therefore so should you. Not particularly helpful. But also, I think a dissonance with understanding the experience of Gen Z coming through, and that actually, in a number of ways, it's not better than what was before. It's certainly not economically better in terms of life chances. could certainly argue it's not better, or definitely not a trajectory of, well, it just gets easier and better for every generation. I know there's some sweeping statements within that, but not just a lack of understanding, but also a lack of willing to understand as well. I find that quite a lot from employers.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, that sense of, you know, our generation, it was very much about we would be expected and indeed would find it completely normal to be thinking about buying our own home, being able to afford to move out. And yet, you know, we hear that they're staying with their parents a lot longer. They perhaps can't afford to go to, if they are going on to university education, they can't afford to do that away from their parents' home. So actually a lot of the things that perhaps we took for granted, they're not able to afford. But I think also I'd love to explore this idea of this view that the things that perhaps we, again, in terms of take for granted around hours of work, commitment to work, that isn't necessarily something that they want to sign up for. I mean, I think I'm certainly aware of that with my own daughters. It amazed me that they don't necessarily think in the same way that I do about the hours you should be putting in, etc. They have a much clearer delineation between work and home and personal life. But it's very difficult to know whether we're just buying into these generalizations or not, because I think for me, there's something about how can you sum up an entire generation with a number of sweeping statements? There's going to be so many differences within that generation, aren't there?
The differences within generations are always going to be bigger than the differences between. And, as 15 years is a rough period of time for length of a generation, there's enough change, economic, social, political, technological, and that will mean outlook is going to be different. But within that, you will, of course, have enormous variation.
If we kind of buy into the idea that we can make some sweeping generalizations, because it's our podcast, we can do what we like. If you, the advice that you give to leaders and employers now about getting the best from Gen Z and about how to hire them, how to develop them, what's the advice that you give to employers?
One of the first things I say is about being really, really clear in everything about how you pitch yourself and how you sell yourself, and really thorough in how you do so. I think there's still something about my generation seeing marketing as something that needs to be slick, or show them that bit, don't show them that bit, leave them with that image and all the rest of it. And Gen Z has got, and I think this is a sweeping statement I can back up, generally their filtering speed around information and messaging is stupendous. And they've had many years of doing it from a formative age. They can tell which employers don't really mean what they say. And even if they think they do mean what they say, they'll do their research quickly to find out whether the experience of current or recent employees backs it up. So it's not that I feel you have to put stacks of information in front of them and demand that they read it, but you do need to do all you can for transparency. And, this generation has had clickbait in very large quantities thrown in their direction their entire conscious life. Unless you're really clear about who you are and what the work is for and purpose, you are not going to stop the scroll.
Is that then that they're more cynical, or just that their bullshit detectors are higher?
Both, I think. I think there is, I've found, both in primary and secondary research, a lot of resentment about older generations and what they describe as, hoarding, the money and the capital, and all these kinds of things. I had Them say things to me like, were you taught about climate change at school? Were you taught about ice caps and all this kind of thing? Yes, I was. Well, why hasn't your generation done anything about it then?
Yeah.
So there's almost, if you've had your chance, if you could back away from the area, we'll take it from here. And, you combine problems like that they've got to solve, and it will be on them, I think, eventually, if not already. You combine that with their general economic inheritance. And at this end, you talk about, well, can they buy a flat or buy a, whatever, or even can they afford to save for any of this? At the other end is, how many of them are ever going to be able to afford to retire?
Yeah.
So these are real, quite genuine grievances. And I think that is part of why they are less willing to go the extra mile, give you my time for free, all those kind of, because they're already at the bad end of an economic deal. I'm not saying that none of them do, but also you've got well over 250,000 Gen Z now registered at Companies House.
Wow.
And
that's
those
in the
numbers
UK,
are growing,
obviously, yeah.
They are growing quickly. Every survey I can find indicates actually quite a large majority now want their own business, but it's not that they expect that necessarily to be the main gig, or maybe a combination of them are, but it's also because they need two streams of income to have any chance of meeting the cost of living. It's also about spreading your bets, so spreading the risk. The next time something happens that apparently could never have been foreseen, COVID, pandemic, global financial crash, whatever it is. So when the employee leaves on the dot and there's resentment from the managers and so on, they might be going to the gym, going home or chilling out, or they might be working on their business. And
it's very interesting as we talk to a lot of HR teams and employers, business leaders about embracing the side gig.
Absolutely.
Again, our generation, if you wanted to have a business on the side, it was almost seen as a lack of commitment to your current business. It was an indulgence. It was, and you had to ask permission. And typically the answer might be, well, you can do it in your own time, but the answer would be, we're not going to be supportive of it. Whereas we're seeing organizations like HubSpot, Nestle, etc. They realize that if they want to retain this generation, they've got to embrace it. And not only that, the benefits of embracing it,
exactly.
The skills that they're learning. You talk about, registering as their own company, the finance information they get for that, the skills of running something, the responsibility. So actually sort of thinking differently about these side gigs. Yeah, it might mean that you only get them 4 days a week working with you, but it could be a huge positive.
Right. You could be a medium-sized company with 5 CEOs on the payroll and 4 of them are running their own thing.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot there that an organisation can use and cultivate. And sometimes I talk to employers who reel off all the things you said at the start of this about, they're lazy, they're feeble, or whatever. And quite a lot of the time I say to them, I think you've probably appointed the wrong people. And they say, well, that's all who applied. Well, then you have to look at how you're pitching yourself to others, because you need to know how many people clicked on the advert, didn't follow through. How appealing a prospect are you to someone who is, a go-getter, wanting to make things happen, wanting to develop things and all the rest of it? Why should, with the barriers to entry so low, why should the best and brightest of Gen Z want to work for you?
And how do employers react when you tell them that?
Well, when it's coming from someone in his 50s and so on, they tend to absorb it a bit more. But I've actually found that within the room or the after chat or whatever, they will have honest conversations. There was somebody I was talking to a group of bankers, and they said, look, all of our websites, we've all got a black background and the words integrity in big white letters on it somewhere. She was paraphrasing. But she said, we see through that. Why do we think they won't.
Yeah.
And if they're shopping around, it means nothing.
Yeah.
They need to feel some authenticity, and even better, they need to feel a sense of an organisation will say, these are the things we need to improve. We want employees who can help us solve these problems if they wish to do so.
And that's a very different approach, isn't it? For, as you say, most hiring teams will be thinking about themselves as a marketing arm of the organization. And it's about presenting your organization in the very best possible light, as opposed to something that we definitely advocate within Disruptive HR, which is that authenticity, that humility. And also, and it would be useful to get your perspective on this, Alex, actually, getting people within the organization to be the voice, the recruiting arm, not necessarily the flash, marketing side, but actual other Gen Z employees who can talk honestly, equipping them, empowering them to have the honest conversation directly.
Get them out on have a TikTok account while it's still here, or whatever it might be, but be seen to take it seriously and use video. I mean, you can fake a video not as easily as audio, but certainly just words on the printed page don't mean as much these days.
Yeah.
And for a lot of Gen Z, TikTok is the search engine of choice. Not Google. Or not anything else, words in black and white. If you've got multiple sources of recent employees, new employees talking about their experiences, and it all matches up, you're creating something quite potent.
Yeah.
And I think organisations that really go for that, and alongside that, tell some stories that maybe aren't so easy.
Yeah.
Where you had to do a bit of "you said we did," and therefore we did this, and so on. That does resonate because it's real. If you just present one side of the story,
this kind of we're all perfect, it's all marvelous. I mean, I was very taken. I think it was Ogilvy, the advertising agency, and this was during Black Lives Matter, so a few years ago now. But a lot of companies were going out there and saying, oh, look at what we do and aren't we marvelous, and, our commitment to diversity and so on. But what they did was actually to put out a statement saying we failed.
Yeah, right.
And you don't often see that. But I thought that's so powerful because that's a way of actually establishing at least some trust that from then you can go on and build. But it's a rare thing, isn't it? That kind of genuine humility.
That know-like trust journey is steeper than it's ever been, and you just can't get enough humility. I think it's not good enough to say how important EDI is to you and all these things. If then you click and look at the top table and you see something different, if they're going to see that, then at least say, we know this is what we currently look like.
Yeah.
This is what this tier looks like. And this is why. And this is where we're going. And here is this program. And we design something with the people who want to do it and people who have done it and so on. Actually really lay this stuff out.
Yeah. So transparency, authenticity, being really clear who you are, inviting their help and meaning it. Don't invite them to help and then ignore them. What about the retention and development side? I mean, one of the things I get from business leaders is, they want to get promoted so quickly. Yeah. They've got a kind of an enhanced sense of their own abilities. Yeah. And I don't know enough about it to wonder whether that's true, and that this generation do want to be promoted more quickly and perhaps at a rate that wouldn't be appropriate, or whether actually it's always been like that and the younger generation have always wanted to get on.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both. I mean, if you do attract really strong people, then they're going to. Academically, Gen Z is off the scale compared to anything that came before. So,
and that's not just what, the newspapers say about falling academic standards. They are
well, again,
genuinely smarter.
it's a clickbait story.
Yeah.
But if I take the percentage of first class degrees, the percentage of degrees that were first class doubled over the course of the 2010s. All right, now you could look at, you pay a lot for university and they're competing and all these kinds of things, but that's not an accident. I think they are very diligent. What I do say to employers, though, is retention starts from day one. All right, you really have to be on that. Don't just give them the spiel about here's our values, here's our thing, and thinking, right, they've heard from the boss, I'll see him around. This generation is very used to the repetition of messages. And if you don't keep repeating it, and if others around the organisation don't keep repeating it, then either might think, well, you didn't mean it, or I'm not hearing it from elsewhere, or worse than that, it's now moved on to something else and you haven't told us.
Yeah.
So, organisations that are really upfront about this stuff, and they will notice themselves repeating it more than the audience, I think can be in a much stronger position, and even better, make the future clear. This is what your end of your first full year could look like, your second, your third, your fourth. Here's some case studies. Here's why we think this is an appropriate trajectory. But yeah, there's people who get through quickly, and there's people who just want a 9-to-5 job and to do it well, and they're not interested in that at all. Because there's a lot of Gen Z not interested in middle management. That is probably now at least as big a problem as just recruitment and retention.
That's really interesting. I'm also interested about hybrid working. We're seeing a lot in the press now about mandating return to work, and a lot of business leaders that I talk to who are uncomfortable about too much working from home will often cite the fact that we've got these young people who work for us and they need to be in the office because they need the social aspect. Mm-hmm. They want to, it's how they learn, is by observing. And if you're cutting that off, then you're doing them a disservice. But on the other hand, we're hearing, but actually they want to work from home. And, do you have any stats or research or even just your own personal experience of this?
It is complex, right? And I know in HR, it's a long running topic. I would say there's Gen Z that were on average first back in the office after COVID, after the lockdowns. And if you're living in a smaller space on average, if you're living in if you're working the same room that you're sleeping in, all those kinds of things. But also they know they need the soft skills, right? Yeah. Generally, the range of workplaces they've been in before their first proper job, if I call it that, is a lot lower than before. So, the sort of Saturday jobs and those things, on average, they're doing fewer of them and they're not getting the work experience out of school in the same way as they did. I think there is more of that now. I think that is a generational thing. By the time the last Gen Z come through, they may have had a better experience. So they don't necessarily have the reference points for it either. So I think there is an imbalance between the academic credentials they're coming in with and the personal development, actually. And that the school curriculum, particularly in England, is quite a big reason for that. Excuse me. But also, I think what they're contending with on their phones and the volume of content that's coming through that and the nature of what they're dealing with and having to filter isn't helping. That the mental health crisis is not made up. It is real. And the numbers of young people with a mental health disorder, diagnosed, not, I watched a YouTube video and I think this, the numbers continue to go up as they hit 20 and in their early 20s.
I was reading something the other day, which is that, mental health issues, this was actually in a kind of, teenage population, sort of 13 to 17, so younger than we're talking about now, but was actually very stable up until 2012. And then, of course, the advent of the smartphone, it's rocketed.
Yeah, it trebled for young females, a course of 10 years between 2008 and 2018. and went up by 50% for males. So, those are really significant. I do think the phones are a lot to do with that. But I also I just think it's very convenient for the older generation to say it's all about the technology. It's not about your economic prospects. It's not about whether you can afford to have your own place, rent, let alone buy, whether you can afford to have kids. Average age of a first-time mother now beyond 30. There's lots of them deciding not to, can't afford it, don't want to bring a child into this world. The birth rate in this country is falling off a cliff.
Mm. Let's move the conversation on and look at another issue that I find absolutely fascinating, and I really could do with some answers in a positive way, Alex, because what a lot of business leaders will say to me is, one of the biggest issues we face is the multi-generational workforce. We've got these, young 20-year-olds and we've got 50-plus-year-olds, and they don't understand each other, and it's a nightmare, and what can we do about it? And on a personal level, I just think this can't be a negative, can it? A multi-generational workforce?
Exactly.
Surely it's got to be something that brings with it real bonuses for you as an employer. But what's your sense? And have you seen any organizations that are doing this well? What is it that they do instead of seeing this as a huge barrier or a problem, seeing it as something that could be hugely valuable?
Yeah, I'd also stress that the reason it's grown as an issue is because the percentage of 65 plus in the workplace, more than doubled in a couple of decades. So it wasn't COVID that raised that suddenly. That's been coming. It wasn't. It was under 5%, and now more than 12 and going up. So you are looking at an age range 40, 50, even 60 years. I think it's another aspect of diversity that's not always brought into that conversation. It's often seen in isolation. The companies or the organisations I see at least tackling this and recognise that they're trying to do something and they want to know what to do, they try to be very clear about what is the same for everybody.
Yeah. What
has to be the same for everybody, rather than assume because you're 20, 40, 60, you will have different values or you will see things differently. I don't think that needs to be a long list, but as soon as people start getting treated differently because of their age, that definitely doesn't sit well with the younger generation, and it doesn't help the older generation who think that might be a good idea anyway. I think when you start getting some reverse mentoring and all that kind of thing going on can be very good. But also it's not allowing people just to sort of work or buddy up in their age group. Think, if there's a 25-year-old and a 75-year-old in the same workplace, they are colleagues.
Yeah.
Get them working together. Make sure there's proper opportunities to have that dialogue and share experience and all those kinds of things. And it takes time to build that kind of culture that can make it happen. Also, employees are generally very interested in what they've got in the organisation, and often leaders don't look. So what percentage of each generation might you have, say, all those in 30s, 40s, 50s? What have you got? What's the intersectionality of that across ethnicity and whatever else? Because it can inspire some people on the ground to know that somebody is looking and therefore trying to quantify the problem they're trying to solve to an extent, but also demonstrate the possibilities that they've got. So it needs some investment, and ideally it needs to be driven from the floor as well.
Yeah.
You've got to get that kind of collaboration which sees outcomes. You've got to create those opportunities for that dialogue to come.
I think that's absolutely right. It's all in the conversation, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's not necessarily big initiatives. I remember hearing about this bank who had done some work around, it was actually introverts and extroverts, and their solution was really powerful, but very simple. It was just pairing introverts and extroverts and getting them to talk about particular topics, how they would approach it. Yeah. And it wasn't about action. It was about understanding. It was just about hearing from each other. So I think sometimes we kind of leap into reverse mentoring, but actually sometimes it's just about, how would you see this? Because it can be so enlightening, can't it? So I think there is a real value in that, just facilitating the conversation, making it deliberate, making it safe to have. It doesn't have to have loads of outcomes or actions ensuing. The outcome is a bit more understanding.
Yeah, and having sometimes a few boundaries on how communication operates.
Yeah.
You know, where was that conversation? Which WhatsApp group, Slack channel, Teams chat? You know, all those kind of. Less is more, I think, with that, because if you're going to get people interacting in ways that aren't verbal or synchronous, then you've got to make it straightforward to create that expectation, everybody being involved.
Yeah, I also like what you said about what's going to be the same and also what's going to be different. Where is their personal choice? Because I get very struck by some companies who still talk about, the great pension scheme that they've got as being a real winner for everybody to sign up and come and join them. And of course, as we know, that isn't necessarily going to do it for somebody in their early 20s. So having that choice, having a choice around, how they're treated in different ways, and being able to have that conversation, but also being clear about, no, this is, everybody gets this and everybody does that, but not making it too long.
That's it. These are the common threads.
So, Alex, really, really fascinating talking to you, and quite it gives me a lot of optimism and hope. There's so many negatives, isn't there? We hear it about older workers too, about that they're stuck in their ways, won't embrace change, that they're not great with digital. And we did a podcast a couple of weeks ago, which was looking at that and the fact that actually that again, it's very dangerous making huge assumptions about a whole generation. There are, as you said, there are more differences than there are similarities. But what you said, I think, is a really powerful endorsement of the fact that Gen Z are eminently employable. They might not do it quite the way we want them to do it, but it's about conversation. It's about engaging with them, and it's all possible. So I just loved what you got to say. When's the book coming out?
Late spring.
Hey, great. Late spring 2025.
Easter, late spring. It's late Easter. I'm holding on to that. So,
let me know as soon as it's out, and we'll make sure we do a bit on social media around it, and I'll be one of your first purchasers.
Oh, thank you very much. Much
appreciated.
It's been
lovely to have you on the show. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, and thanks for watching. If you found it useful, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications to get more videos like this.